The rain poured down on Atlanta like a heavy, gray curtain, covering the cobblestone streets and towering buildings with lights. The sound of water trickling on the sidewalk mingled with the distant hum of traffic, creating a chaotic symphony of the city at night. At the center of it all, the Regal Crown Hotel stood like a gem, the golden light from the chandeliers in the main lobby spilling out, piercing through the rain, inviting weary souls to seek shelter. But not everyone was welcome. Daniel Harris pushed through the hotel's revolving glass doors, stepping in with his sneakers soaked, water dripping from his black hooded jacket onto the polished marble floor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but his posture was slightly hunched, not from fatigue, but because he was trying to keep himself small, inconspicuous, avoiding the prying eyes of the outside world. The old backpack slung over his shoulder looked out of place in the luxurious space, where men in finely tailored suits and women in evening gowns glided by like elegant ghosts. Daniel didn't belong here, at least. That's what people would think at first glance. He pulled his hood down, revealing deep brown eyes, reflecting weariness but also determination. Daniel Harris was no stranger to the limelight. He was a Hollywood star, recently winning an Oscar for his leading role in Echoes of Freedom, a film that had moved millions with its story of struggle and hope. But tonight, he didn't want to be Daniel Harris, the star. He just wanted to be an ordinary man, seeking a place to rest after 3 months of continuous filming and relentless interviews. He had booked the presidential suite through his assistant under a pseudonym James Carter to avoid attention. The Regal Crown, with its reputation as a retreat for the elite, seemed like the perfect choice. Or so it seemed. The hotel's main lobby was another world. Polished walnut walls, deep red Persian carpets stretching underfoot, and the scent of high-end perfume lingered in the air. The giggles of a group of guests echoed from the distant bar, where the light from wine glasses sparkled like stars. Daniel approached the reception desk, trying to keep his breathing steady. He didn't like the noise, didn't like the stares of strangers, and especially didn't like the feeling of being judged. But he was used to it, or at least, he told himself he was. Behind a reception desk, Emily Carter stood with her hands clasped together, her lips pressed tightly. The young woman, about 25 years old, with her blonde hair pulled high and her pale blue eyes cold. The Regal Crown uniform crisp white shirt and navy blue vest hugged her figure, creating a professional look but couldn't hide the tension in her eyes. This was her 3rd week working here, and the pressure of serving wealthy, demanding guests had kept her on high alert. Emily grew up in a small town in rural Georgia, where stories of outsiders were often told with a tone of warning rather than curiosity. And Daniel, with his wet hoodie, muddy shoes, and dark skin, was the image of an outsider in her eyes. "Hello," Daniel said, his voice deep and soft, trying to offer a friendly smile despite the rain still dripping from the strands of hair falling across his forehead. "I have a reservation under the name James Carter. Suite on the top floor." Emily didn't reply immediately. She tilted her head, looking him up and down, her gaze lingering on his worn backpack and rough hands that had held prop guns on screen, had clasped hands with co-stars in emotional scenes, but now were simply the hands of tired man. She didn't see a man who had booked a 5-star suite. She saw someone who didn't belong. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone sharp, with an undisguised hint of suspicion. "Do you have a reservation code?" Daniel nodded, taking his phone from his pocket, his fingers quickly swiping across the screen. He was prepared for situations like this, moments where his skin color made people question before trusting. "Here," he said, turning the screen towards her, showing the confirmation email from Regal Crown with a 6-letter code. "I booked through the app. Paid in advance." Emily glanced at the screen, but her expression didn't change. She didn't check the system, didn't type the code into the computer as she should have. Instead, She folded her arms, taking a small step back as if the distance between her and Daniel needed to be widened. "I'm not sure this is right," she said, her voice even but carrying something sharper than the rain outside. "You might have the wrong hotel. This is the Regal Crown, not a place for everyone." Daniel paused. He clearly heard the hesitation in her word, everyone a roundabout way of saying, "This isn't a place for people like you." He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Can you check the code?" he asked, his voice still soft but starting to harden at the end of the sentence. "I'm not mistaken. I know where I am." But Emily didn't move. She looked at him, her pale blue eyes now like two cold stones, emotionless. In her mind, the prejudices nurtured from her years growing up in a small town began to rise. She imagined him as a fraud, someone trying to sneak into a place he didn't belong, a potential threat in this luxurious space. She didn't see Daniel Harris, the movie star. She only saw a black man in inappropriate attire, and that was enough for her to pass judgment. "Wait a moment," she said, then turned and pressed the intercom button under the counter. Her voice echoed through the small speaker, short and decisive. "I need security in the main lobby. Right now." Daniel frowned, a feeling of unease rising in his chest. He was no stranger to suspicion, but this time it came too quickly, too blatantly. He looked around, noticing a few pairs of eyes from the crowd, turning towards him, a man in a suit raising an eyebrow, a woman clutching her handbag as if he was about to snatch it. The sound of the rain outside seemed louder, drowning out the pounding of his heart in his ears. He knew what was about to happen, but he didn't expect it to happen so fast. Emily stood straight, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, her eyes fixed on Daniel. She didn't say another word, but her silence was heavier than any accusation. To her, he wasn't a customer. He was a problem to be solved. Daniel tightened his grip on the backpack strap, the cold wetness from his jacket seeping into his skin, now mixed with a simmering anger in his heart. He had faced prejudice before, had heard whispers behind his back, but standing here in the luxurious hotel lobby, under Emily's cold gaze, he felt like he was being stripped bare, not a star, not a successful man, but just someone denied the right to be present. The door behind the counter burst open, and two security guards stepped out, their figures towering in black uniforms. Their footsteps echoed rhythmically on the stone floor, like the beat of a drum, signaling a battle Daniel didn't want to join. He looked at Emily, then at the people around him, and for a moment, he wondered, could he prove anything, or was it all meaningless? The rain outside continued to fall, but inside the Regal Crown, another storm was brewing. The footsteps of the two security guards echoed like the beat of a fateful drum on the marble floor of the Regal Crown lobby. They approached Daniel Harris, their tall figures in black uniforms forming a living wall, separating him from the luxurious space he had just entered. Daniel stood still, his hands still gripping the backpack straps, rainwater dripping from his hoodie onto the floor, forming mottled streaks reflecting the magnificent chandeliers above. He didn't turn to look at them immediately, his eyes still fixed on Emily, as if searching for a glimmer of reason in her cold blue eyes. But there was nothing but rigidity, a judgment already made before he could even open his mouth. "You need to leave," one of the guards said, his voice deep and even, as if he had said this sentence hundreds of times before. This man, with his short-cropped hair and expressionless face, stood less than a meter from Daniel, his hand resting casually on his belt, where a walkie-talkie dangled like a warning. "We don't want any trouble." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his chest was burning. "I'm not causing trouble," he said, slowly but firmly. "I have a reservation. I've given the confirmation code. She just needs to check." He nodded towards Emily, hoping once again that logic would prevail. But Emily didn't move. She stood behind a reception desk, her arms folded, her lips pressed into a straight line. "I've already told you," she replied, her voice slightly higher, as if the presence of the guards had given her more confidence. "You're in the wrong place. We don't have a room for you." She emphasized the word used subtly, but enough for everyone to recognize the hidden meaning. Not customer, not reservation holder. Just use someone who didn't belong in her eyes. Before Daniel could respond, another voice rang out, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the space. "What's going on here?" Richard Grayson, the manager of the Regal Crown, stepped out from the door behind a reception desk. He was a middle-aged man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, a pricey gray suit hugging his slightly stocky figure. Richard's small, sharp eyes scanned the lobby, then stopped at Daniel, like a hawk spotting its prey. He wasn't as tall as Daniel, but the way he stood shoulders straight, chin up, exuded the dominance of someone used to giving orders. Emily turned to Richard, her voice quieter but still firm. "Sir, this man says he has a reservation, but I don't believe him. He doesn't fit our hotel." She hesitated on the last word, but her eyes spoke volumes. Richard nodded slightly, as if he understood immediately from the first glance. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had met people like Richard before, those who hid prejudice under a veneer of professionalism, but never truly concealed the contempt in their eyes. "I have proof," he said, raising his phone again, the screen still lit with the confirmation email. "I'm not lying. I just want to go to my room." Richard didn't bother looking at the phone. He stepped closer, his polished leather shoes clicking on the floor. "Listen here," he said, his voice deep but ice cold. "We have the right to refuse service to anyone who doesn't meet the Regal Crown standards. And you," he paused, looking Daniel up and down, from his wet hoodie to his muddy shoes, "you clearly don't belong here." Richard's words hit Daniel like a punch to the chest. He stood there, in the middle of the lobby, feeling like the chandeliers above had suddenly become too bright, too hot. The crowd in the lobby, the guests in their elegant attire, the people who had been laughing and chatting at the bar now turned to look. Some whispered to each other, some shook their heads, a few even sneered. Daniel heard a woman's voice from behind. "I told you, those kinds of people always cause trouble." He didn't turn to see who it was, but the sentence was like a second knife stabbing into his self-esteem. "Those kinds of people?" Daniel repeated, his voice no longer gentle. He took a step forward, facing Richard, his brown eyes burning with the anger he had been suppressing from the beginning. "What do you mean by those kinds of people?" Richard didn't back down. He smiled a thin, cold, and arrogant smile. "You know what I'm talking about," he replied, his voice lowered but loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "Don't play innocent. People like you don't belong in my hotel. Get out before I call the police." The space seemed to freeze. The rain outside the glass windows continued to fall steadily, but inside, a heavy silence enveloped everything. Daniel felt every pair of eyes in the lobby fixed on him, as if he were an animal herded into a cage for everyone to examine. He wanted to shout, wanted to slam his hand on the counter and force them to check the reservation code, force them to admit he had the right to be there. But he knew, in that moment, no words could change their perception. To Richard, to Emily, and to the watching crowd, he wasn't Daniel Harris, the Hollywood star, the man who had overcome countless obstacles to stand at the top. He was just a black man, an outsider, a stain on the Regal Crown's perfect image. "You don't need to call the police," Daniel said, his voice now low, almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of restraint. "I'll leave, but you'll regret this." He turned to walk out the door, but Richard wasn't finished. "Yes, go," he called after him, his voice louder, as if wanting the whole world to hear. "And next time, find a place that suits you better. This isn't a cheap motel for your kind." The final insult echoed like an explosion in Daniel's head. He stopped in the middle of the lobby, his hands gripping the backpack straps so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to turn back, to confront Richard, to wipe the smug smile off his face. But then he heard laughter not from Richard, but from the crowd. A small, intermittent laugh from a man in a suit standing near the bar. The laughter spread, like a wave, followed by mocking glances and headshakes. Daniel felt stripped bare, not by Richard's words, but by the complicity of the bystanders, those who chose to remain silent or laugh rather than speak up. The guard stepped forward, one placing a hand on his shoulder, not forcefully, but enough to urge him to keep walking. "Let's go," he said, his voice dry. Daniel shook his hand off, his eyes flashing like knives across the faces of everyone in the lobby: Emily, Richard, the crowd. He said nothing more. He turned, pushed through the revolving glass doors, and stepped outside. The rain greeted him, cold and relentless, soaking through his hoodie, mixing with the anger and humiliation burning inside him. He stood there, under the dim streetlights, his breath forming white puffs in the humid air. Behind him, through the glass, he heard Richard's loud laughter, as if he had just won a victory. But Daniel didn't turn back. He took his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling from the cold and anger. He opened the recording app, which he had turned on the moment Richard appeared, and checked. Everything was saved, every insult, every mocking remark. He smiled faintly, a smile devoid of joy. "You'll pay for this," he whispered to himself, his voice blending with the sound of the rain. Inside the Regal Crown lobby, the lights were still bright, the crowd still laughing and chatting, as if nothing had happened. But outside, in the rain, a real storm was brewing, and it would not forgive. The rain continued to pour down relentlessly, the cold droplets hitting Daniel Harris's face as if trying to wash away the humiliation that was choking him. He stood outside the revolving glass doors of the Regal Crown, his breath forming white puffs in the humid Atlanta air. Richard Grayson's laughter still echoed in his ears, even though the doors had closed, separating him from the brightly lit lobby. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the anger surging through his veins. He gripped the phone in his hand, the recording still running, capturing every insult he had endured. But even though he knew he had evidence, the feeling of being stripped bare in front of the crowd wouldn't dissipate. The guards didn't take their eyes off him. The two men in black uniforms stood just inside the glass doors, their eyes piercing through the rain, as if ensuring he wouldn't dare return. Daniel had no intention of returning, not now. He turned and walked away, his muddy sneakers hitting the wet sidewalk, each step heavy as if carrying the world he had just been denied. The old backpack on his shoulder sagged, the strap rubbing against his skin through the soaked hoodie. He didn't know where he was going, he only knew he needed to leave this place, leave the gaze of Emily, the arrogance of Richard, and the mocking laughter of the crowd. But fate wouldn't let him go far. As Daniel crossed the small street leading to the main avenue, one of the guards, the one with short hair and a dry voice, pushed through the glass door and stepped outside. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the rain. "You forgot this." Daniel turned, frowning, just in time to see the guard throw something towards him. It was the hood he had pulled down in the lobby, now wet and crumpled, flying through the air like a final reminder of the contempt he had received. He reached out to catch it, but a sudden gust of wind blew, pulling the hood off course. Daniel slipped on the slippery sidewalk, lost his balance, and fell to the ground. A thump sounded as his knee hit the pavement, water splashing around him. The backpack slipped off his shoulder, tearing open on one side, revealing a thick stack of papers falling out the script for the movie Echoes of Freedom, with his name printed in bold on the cover. Daniel Harris lead role. The guard stood there, a few meters away, bursting into laughter. "What a great performance!" he called out, then turned back inside, leaving Daniel alone in the rain. Daniel knelt on the sidewalk, his hands braced against the cold pavement, rainwater running through his fingers. He gasped for breath, his breath mingling with the sound of the rain. And in that moment, he felt like the whole world had collapsed around him. Not because of the fall, not because of the pain in his knee, but because of the fact that he, a man who had overcome countless obstacles, who had stood at the top of Hollywood, was being treated like he was worthless just because of his skin color. He bowed his head, looking at the wet script lying on the ground, the ink smudged by the water, and a deep pain welled up inside him. But then, a voice cut through the rain. "Oh my God, that's Daniel Harris." A young girl, about 18 years old, stood a few steps away, her umbrella shaking in her hand. She wore a bright yellow jacket, her eyes wide with surprise, her phone already pointed towards him. "I can't believe it. You're Daniel Harris, right? From Echoes of Freedom. I've seen your movie 3 times." Her voice rang out excitedly, but Daniel didn't respond. He just looked up, his deep brown eyes now blurred by rain and exhaustion. The girl didn't wait for him to answer. She started recording a video, her hand trembling slightly with excitement. "Everyone look, Daniel Harris is in Atlanta, right in front of the Regal Crown. But wait, he's all wet. What happened?" She stepped closer, the light from the street lamps shining on Daniel's face. And then she saw the script on the ground, the muddy shoes, his pitiful appearance. "Oh no, what did they do to you?" She whispered, her voice shifting from excitement to concern. Daniel stood up slowly, water dripping from his hoodie onto his hands. "Nothing," he said, his voice hoarse, trying to pick up the script and stuff it back into his backpack. "Just a misunderstanding." But the girl didn't believe him. She turned the camera towards the Regal Crown, where the silhouettes of the 2 guards were still visible through the glass doors. "A misunderstanding when you look like this? They kicked you out, didn't they? A star like you being treated like this?" Daniel didn't want to continue. He turned to walk away, but the girl called out, "Wait, I'm going to post this online. People need to know what's happening." Before he could stop her, she pressed the button to post the video on Instagram with the caption, "Daniel Harris kicked out of the Regal Crown in the rain. What's going on here?" She added the hashtags #Justice for Daniel and #Regal Crown Scandal, then looked at him with a determined look. "I'm your fan. I won't let them do this to you." Daniel just nodded faintly, saying nothing more. He walked away, his tall figure fading into the rain, but the story didn't stop there. Within minutes, the girl's video, her name was Mia, spread like wildfire on social media. The first people to watch were only curious because of the name Daniel Harris, but when they saw him fall, saw his pitiful appearance in the rain, the curiosity quickly turned into outrage. Comments began to flood in. "This is blatant racism. Who do they think they are to do this to Daniel Harris? I'll never set foot in that hotel again." Meanwhile, Daniel found a hidden corner under the awning of a closed store, a few blocks from the Regal Crown. He sat down, leaning against the wall, the wet backpack beside him. He opened his phone, checked the recording again. Everything was still clear, from Emily's suspicious voice to Richard's insults. He sighed, then opened Twitter. The #, Regal Crown Scandal was already trending, with thousands of posts appearing in just 15 minutes. One person reposted Mia's video, adding the caption, "Oscar winner treated like trash Regal Crown. Explain yourselves." Another wrote, "This is why I hate these fancy places. They think their money buys them the right to discriminate." Daniel scrolled through the posts, his emotions mixed. He didn't want this to get so big, he just wanted to rest, just wanted to forget this terrible night. But the truth had erupted, and he couldn't put it out. A notification popped up on the screen. The official Regal Crown account had just posted a status. "We are investigating the incident in our lobby tonight. The Regal Crown is committed to providing the best experience for all guests." Under the post Hundreds of comments responded immediately. Too late. You kicked Daniel Harris out because he's black. Don't pretend to apologize. In the Regal Crown lobby, Richard Grayson stood behind the reception desk, his face flushed with anger. He had just received a call from the regional CEO, who yelled through the phone, "What have you done? Do you know who Daniel Harris is?" Richard growled, throwing the phone down on the desk. "I don't care who he is. He looked like a homeless person, and I have the right to refuse service." Emily stood beside him, her face pale, her hands trembling as she looked at the computer screen. The reservation code for James Carter actually existed, and it had been fully paid. Outside, under the cold awning, Daniel turned off his phone, closing his eyes. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. The Regal Crown had dug its own grave. The truth had erupted, and that fire wouldn't be easily extinguished. The rain had stopped, but the atmosphere in Atlanta was still heavy and humid, as if the city was holding its breath after what had just happened in front of the Regal Crown. Inside the hotel, the chandeliers still shone brightly, but the glamour was now just a fragile facade covering an irreparable crack. The Daniel Harris scandal had spread across social media, from Twitter to Instagram, from local news sites to major newspapers like the New York Times and CNN. Headlines splashed everywhere. Oscar winner kicked out of luxury hotel, racism or misunderstanding. Regal Crown faces boycott wave after shocking incident. Each article, each video, each tweet was like a hammer blow to the hotel's decades-built reputation. Richard Grayson sat in the manager's office, the door closed, the curtains drawn, as if he could isolate himself from the storm raging outside. On the desk was a cold cup of coffee, a phone constantly ringing with calls from the parent company's leadership, and a computer screen displaying plummeting reservation numbers. In just 3 days since the incident, more than 60% of customers had canceled their bookings, from conference hosting companies to politicians who had once considered the Regal Crown their favorite destination. He growled, slamming his hand on the desk, tipping the coffee cup over, the black liquid spreading like a prophecy of what was to come. All because of a black guy, he muttered, his voice hoarse with anger and exhaustion. But deep down, Richard knew he was wrong, not because he regretted it, but because he realized the price to pay was higher than he had imagined. Emily Carter stood in the hallway, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes blank. She had just been called into the Human Resources office, where the regional director announced that she was suspended indefinitely. "We need to calm public opinion," he said, his voice cold over the phone. "You were the first person to contact Daniel Harris. You should have known better." Emily didn't argue. She returned home, her small apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, and curled up on the sofa, the TV screen playing Mia's video over and over, the scene of Daniel falling in the rain, the scene of her standing behind the counter with a suspicious look. Her phone vibrated constantly with messages from friends and family. Why did you do that? Didn't you recognize who he was? But the question that haunted her the most came from herself. Why did I let prejudice lead me like that? Meanwhile, Daniel Harris didn't appear in public. He rented a small apartment in Midtown, away from the spotlight and interviews. He refused all invitations to appear on TV channels, from Good Morning America to The Tonight Show. "I don't want to say anything right now," he texted his assistant, his voice short in the message. But his silence didn't mean he was idle. Every night, he sat in front of the computer, reviewing the recording from the Regal Crown, listening to Richard's words echoing through his headphones. "People like you don't belong here." Each time he listened, the anger inside him didn't subside, but turned into something sharper plan. The scandal lasted for a week, then 2 weeks, and the Regal Crown began to feel the real price. Sponsors withdrew, business partners terminated contracts, and revenue plummeted to the lowest level in the hotel's history. One morning, the parent company's leadership issued an announcement. The Regal Crown would be put up for sale to cut losses. The news spread quickly, and on social media, people celebrated like a victory. Justice for Daniel Harris. Regal Crown deserves to fall. Richard was fired the next day, without an apology, without a chance to explain. He left the hotel with a small box containing his personal belongings, his face flushed with humiliation, and the thought that it was all Daniel's fault still repeating in his head. Emily, now unemployed, faced another personal tragedy. Friends gradually distanced themselves from her. Her family, who had their own prejudices, constantly criticized her. "You've embarrassed the whole family," her mother said over the phone, her voice harsh. Emily sat alone in her apartment, looking out the window, and for the first time, she wondered if she could change. She opened her computer, searched for articles about Daniel Harris, rewatched echoes of Freedom the movie she had never cared about before. The scene of Daniel standing in the crowd, shouting for justice, sent shivers down her spine. She realized he wasn't just a star, he was a fighter, and she had stood on the opposite side. While the Regal Crown was in chaos, Daniel quietly took action. He contacted a major real estate company in Atlanta, a place that specialized in dealing with distressed assets. Through his assistant, he requested to participate in the Regal Crown auction under the name of a shell company, Horizon Investments, to keep his identity secret. He didn't tell anyone, not even his closest friends, about this plan. Every night, he sat with his lawyer, discussing details, calculating every number. "I don't want them to know who I am until everything is done," he said, his voice deep but determined. "I want them to feel what I felt: powerless, disenfranchised." The auction day arrived, a gloomy morning in downtown Atlanta. The Regal Crown was put up for sale in a large meeting room of the real estate company, with investors in expensive suits filling the seats. No one noticed a man wearing sunglasses, wearing a long gray coat, sitting in the back row. Daniel Harris, anonymous in the crowd, listened to every word of the moderator. The starting price was $20 million, but the atmosphere in the room was cold. The scandal had significantly reduced the hotel's value. A few investors raised their paddles, offering timid numbers, but then a voice rang out from the back: $50 million. The whole room turned around. The man in sunglasses stood up, stepped forward, his voice deep and firm. "Horizon Investments. $50 million. I want to finish this quickly." No one dared to bid against him. The number was too high, too unexpected. The moderator banged the gavel, announcing that the Regal Crown was officially sold. But when the contract was signed, Daniel took off his sunglasses, revealing the face that the world knew from the screen. Whispers spread through the room, then turned into stunned silence. A reporter present took a photo, and within minutes, the news spread online. Daniel Harris buys the Regal Crown, perfect revenge. Richard, now sitting in his small house in the suburbs, turned on the TV and saw Daniel's face on the screen. He threw the remote on the floor, shouting, "Impossible." But it was true. Emily, in her apartment, watched the news with wide eyes, her hands trembling. She didn't know how to feel: ashamed, amazed, or a little hopeful. Daniel didn't appear before the press immediately. He stood alone in the Regal Crown's main lobby on the day he officially took over, looking around the space that had rejected him. The chandeliers still shone, but now it belonged to him. He smiled faintly, not because of victory, but because he knew this was just the first step. He didn't buy the hotel for revenge, he bought it to change it. And in his mind, a bigger plan was forming. A plan where the Regal Crown, or rather Horizon Haven, would become a symbol of what he had always fought for: justice. Outside, the world was still seething with the incident, but Daniel remained silent. His counterattack was not loud, it was silent, sharp, and relentless. The regal crown had fallen, but from those ashes, something new was about to be born. The early morning sun shone through the large glass windows of the hotel, streaks of pale golden light stretching across the marble floor, now cleared of the rainwater stains from that fateful night. The regal crown was no more. The brass sign bearing the hotel's name had been taken down, replaced by a new logo, Horizon Haven, with a small line underneath, "Where everyone belongs." Daniel Harris stood in the main lobby, his hands in his pockets, his deep brown eyes surveying the space he had transformed. The walnut-paneled walls were still there, but now adorned with paintings by local artists, black, white, Latino, each work telling a story of struggle and triumph. The scent of high-end perfume no longer lingered in the air, replaced by the natural, simple, and warm scent of wood. This was no longer a place reserved for the elite. It was a place for everyone. Daniel didn't buy the regal crown to tear it down. He bought it to rebuild, to turn it into a symbol of what he had believed since he was a boy growing up in the slums of Detroit, that no one should be denied just because of who they are. In the 3 months since he took over, he had worked tirelessly. He hired a new management team, organized diversity and inclusion training programs for staff, and opened the hotel for community events from art exhibitions to equality rights workshops. But what he focused on most was changing the culture of the place. "I want everyone to walk in here and feel welcome," he told his team at the first meeting. "No suspicion, no judgment, only respect." Today was the official opening day of Horizon Haven, and the atmosphere in the lobby was filled with laughter and chatter. The guests were no longer men in expensive suits or women in glamorous evening gowns. They were families, students, ordinary working people from all over Atlanta. A small stage had been set up in the corner of the lobby, where a local jazz band was playing smooth tunes, and a long table was laden with free food from hamburgers to Vietnamese pho, reflecting the city's diversity. Daniel stood quietly, watching the crowd pass by, and for the first time since that night in the rain, he felt a sense of peace. But not everything was easy. Horizon Haven's transformation faced no small amount of criticism. Some called it a cheap PR stunt by Daniel, a way for him to polish his image after the scandal. Others, including Richard Grayson, publicly mocked him on social media. From his small house in the suburbs, Richard posted a long article on Facebook. "Daniel Harris thinks he can turn the regal crown into a flea market for lowlifes. He'll destroy everything we've built." The post received a few hundred likes, mostly from former Regal Crown regulars, but it was quickly swamped by thousands of opposing comments. "You're a racist. Shut up. Horizon Haven is 100 times better than the Regal Crown." Richard turned off his computer, sitting alone in silence, but the bitterness inside him didn't subside. Emily Carter stood in a corner of the lobby, her hands gripping the edge of her new vest, the Horizon Haven uniform, a gentle green instead of the Regal Crown's rigid navy blue. She hadn't intended to come back. After being fired, she spent weeks locking herself in her apartment, struggling with feelings of shame and guilt. But then a letter arrived, not by email, but handwritten with Daniel's strong handwriting. "You have a chance to make amends. I don't want you to be defined by a mistake. Come to Horizon Haven, if you're willing." She cried when she read it, not because she was forgiven, but because she wasn't sure she deserved it. Daniel didn't force her to come back. He let her decide for herself. And after many sleepless nights, Emily appeared in his office, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can make up for it, but I want to try." Daniel just nodded, asking no more questions. He placed her on the new front desk team, but this time, she didn't just work, she attended training sessions, listened to stories of prejudice from her colleagues, and gradually, she began to change. Today, she stood there, greeting each guest with a sincere smile. And when a black man walked in with an old backpack, she didn't hesitate. "Welcome to Horizon Haven," she said, her voice warm. The man nodded his thanks, and Emily felt a weight lift from her heart. The opening reached its climax when Daniel stepped onto the stage. He wore a simple suit, no tie, his hair short and neat, but still natural. The crowd fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned to him, not with suspicion or mockery like the night before, but with curiosity and admiration. He held the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. I stood here, right in this lobby, 3 months ago, he said, his voice deep but resonant. I wasn't welcome. I was rejected, insulted, pushed out into the rain, not because I did anything wrong, but because of who I am. He paused, looking around, letting his words sink into the space. I thought about letting it go, forgetting it, but then I realized if I didn't do anything, places like this would continue to reject people like me, like you, just because of skin color, because of clothes, because of background. The crowd applauded, some shouting their agreement. Daniel raised his hand, signaling them to be quiet. I didn't buy this hotel for revenge, he continued. I bought it to turn it into a place where no one has to feel like I felt. Horizon Haven isn't mine, it's ours. I want you to walk in here and know that you belong here, without having to prove anything. The applause rang out again, louder this time, longer. An elderly woman in the crowd wiped away tears. A young boy waved at Daniel, as if he were a superhero. Daniel smiled a genuine smile, not forced, not bitter. He stepped off the stage, mingling with the crowd, shaking hands with everyone, listening to their stories. A young girl, Mia, who had filmed the video that night, ran up and hugged him. I knew you could do it, she said, her eyes shining. Daniel laughed, patting her shoulder. Thank you for starting it all. That night, as the guests gradually left, Daniel stood alone in the now quiet lobby. He looked up at the chandelier, the only thing left from the regal crown, and remembered the night he was pushed out. He wasn't angry anymore. He had turned that pain into something bigger. Emily approached, hesitating. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice soft but sincere, for giving me a chance. Daniel looked at her, his eyes gentle but firm. Don't thank me, he replied. Prove that you deserve it. Emily nodded, her eyes red, then turned away, leaving Daniel alone with his new crown. Outside, Atlantis still lived, still breathed, but Horizon Haven was now a different part of the city, a beacon in the darkness, a reminder that from ashes, good things can be born. Daniel stepped out the door, looked up at the night sky, and whispered to himself, this is just the beginning. Daniel Harris's story is a vivid testament to the power of resilience. Rejected, insulted, and pushed out simply because of his skin color, he didn't choose to collapse or seek revenge through violence. Instead, he turned his pain into motivation to create change. Buying the regal crown and transforming it into Horizon Haven was not only a personal victory, but also a symbol of overcoming social prejudice. Even in the darkest moments, people can find light if they don't give up. The story emphasizes that adversity doesn't define us, how we face it is what matters. When faced with injustice or failure, don't let anger or despair control you. Be patient, plan, and use difficulties as a springboard to rise. Like Daniel, you can turn closed doors into opportunities to open new horizons. Through the actions of Emily and Richard, the story exposes the dark side of prejudice, which makes them see Daniel not as a human being, but as a stereotype based on skin color and appearance. Emily suspected him from the start, while Richard publicly insulted him without evidence. The consequences were not only the collapse of the regal crown, but also their personal tragedies. Richard lost his job. Emily faced shame and isolation. Prejudice not only hurts others, but also destroys the bearer, turning them into victims of their own narrow-mindedness. Don't rush to judge others based on appearances or what you consider normal. Take the time to listen and learn the truth. A wrong decision stemming from prejudice can lead to irreparable consequences, both for others and for yourself. Daniel's forgiveness of Emily is a bright spot in the story. Instead of punishing her for her role in the incident, he chose to reach out, inviting her back to Horizon Haven to atone. This action not only demonstrates compassion, but also shows his belief in people's ability to change. As a result, Emily not only became a better employee, but also began her journey of self-correction. Forgiveness is not weakness, but the strength to create positive change, both in others and in oneself. Don't hold grudges against those who have hurt you. If they're willing to change, give them a chance not to erase the past, but to build a better future. Forgiveness is a way to free yourself from the burden of bitterness. Daniel didn't just stop at buying the hotel, he turned it into Horizon Haven, a place symbolizing justice and inclusion. He used his power and influence to send a message. Injustice cannot be tolerated, and everyone has a responsibility to fight to change it. His opening the hotel to all social classes, from ordinary workers to artists, shows that justice is not just about correcting oneself, but about creating a better world for everyone. The story is a call to action. When you have the opportunity, stand up for what is right. Don't be silent in the face of injustice, whether it happens to you or others. Use your voice, actions, and talents to create change, no matter how small. A courageous step can inspire an entire community. The story closes with the image of Horizon Haven rising from the ashes of the regal crown, a meaningful rebirth. What was once a symbol of arrogance and discrimination has become a beacon of hope and unity. Daniel's journey shows that even the deepest wounds can be transformed into a source of strength if we choose to face and build from them. Nothing is completely over as long as you believe in the ability to start over. When life pushes you to the bottom, don't think it's the end. See it as an opportunity to recreate yourself and your surroundings. From losses, you can build something more beautiful, as Daniel did with Horizon Haven. The story from ashes. A New Crown is not just Daniel Harris's personal journey, but also a mirror reflecting society where prejudice, injustice, and resilience coexist. It celebrates human strength in the face of adversity while warning of the price of narrow-mindedness. The values draw on resilience, avoiding judgment, forgiveness, fighting for justice, and rebirth from failure are timeless lessons, reminding us that everyone has the ability to transform not only their lives, but also the world around them.